Older than November.
Sometimes.
Came back in my
Roll.
Did we make her calls so she can track?
All right, it's 5. We ready to go over there?
Are you all?
We'll let roll. So,
I was about to say, that almost looks like the same shirt you and
Missed the audit for anything.
what's that?
Missed the audit for anything.
that one day when him and Brian were like twins. Looked like that.
All right, everybody, we will open up our work session and the audit presentation. Are you kicking off or are we going right to?
Sure. So with us tonight, we have Nancy Schultz. You have seen her before. She's a partner with Bergen KDB, and she will be presenting the results of our audit for this year. So we'll just turn it over to Nancy.
Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Right now I'm looking at a picture of the top
Hang
of
on,
City Hall.
Nancy. Jim's doing something.
I brought popcorn.
Oh, well, good. We got that out of the way.
Could have been worse.
It could have been worse.
It's a good thing you're sitting by him, Krista.
Didn't bring it up for everybody. Didn't bring it up to share.
For me.
Didn't bring it up to share, I see.
That's fine.
All right, sorry, Nancy. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'll start with talking about the independent auditors reports to start with. So we have several different formal letters that we include as part of the audit, and the most important one is the independent auditors report in the front of the financial statements. It houses our opinion. It starts out by including that opinion, which is different from previous years. So we've redone the order. So that opinion is front and center. And it is an unmodified opinion, which is the best that we as your auditors can offer. Indicates that everything is fairly stated based on the results of the audit. So again, the best as we, as your auditors, can offer the city. And then we have some other reports. The first one is our report on internal control over financial reporting related to government auditing standards. So these standards are in addition to our generally accepted audit standards, and they require us to look closer at internal control and also compliance with laws, regulations, contracts, and grants. And based on the work that we did in accordance with those standards, we do have the one internal control finding, the lack of segregation of accounting duties. This isn't new for Fergus Falls, and it didn't change from the previous year. It's still at that middle level finding. It is just inherent based on the number of staff that you have performing some of the functions, some of those day-to-day functions, and some of the overall oversight of your financial statements. So payroll and the finance director are the two areas that create that finding and put it in writing. As far as the finance director's access to the system on a regular basis, the ability to create journal entries. Not that those are ever created without approval. Approval always happens, and we do have mitigating controls in place to make sure that things aren't slipping through. But just when we look at it high level, that's where the segregation concerns lie. So questions on that comment at all? I know it's not new for your city.
I have one, Nancy, just for the benefit of myself. We have that every year, and it's not a concern. And so my question isn't related to that. It's just more for us to not have that finding. How much more employees would we need in that department to have the appropriate segregation of duties to not have that be a finding?
Yeah, as far as number, I'm not sure what that number, what the magic number is. The things that you'd have to change are the finance director's access to anything that's day-to-day. And then also there are some areas in payroll. Payroll is pretty much run by one employee, which is effective for your city. But there would be some segregation required there. So those are the two big things that would reduce this down to a verbal finding.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, and we had no compliance findings as it relates to those government auditing standards, so that's good news. Then our next report is the report on uniform guidance, and this has to do with the federal funds that the city received. So if you spend over $750,000 in federal funds, we're required to perform what's called a single audit, taking a closer look at some of those federal funds. And what we tested this year was your airport improvement program, because you did spend just over $1 million in total in federal money. And when we're looking in that program, we're given an unmodified opinion on the compliance that was significant to that program, and also no internal control findings over that compliance. So a complete clean report as it relates to the single audit and the federal funding. Then we have our report on Minnesota legal compliance, and this is the last official letter that we issue. And the Office of the State Auditor of Minnesota is very specific about the statutes as they relate to accounting matters that they want us to look into every year. So they give us a checklist, and we complete that checklist. And based on that completion, we had no findings again this year. So really just the one finding for all of those reports. So congratulations on that. And then we have the communication letter, which is the payment that you received that is not included in the financial statements, and that includes required communication and financial analysis. And we'll go over the financial analysis in just a bit, but the required communications, those pages are things that our standards require us to put in writing to you as the governing body for the city of Fergus Falls. And it would be our tool if we had anything significant or unusual that we uncovered. And it also houses just kind of those standard things that are included in the audit. Again, talks about responsibilities for the audit, talks about estimates, policies that we identified. All those things are there, but nothing strays from our standard in that section for the city. So clean bill of health, if you will. So questions on any of those communications? All right, hearing none, I will move on to the financial analysis, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the general fund, and that's where we're going to start. So overall, what you're seeing here is the fund balance for the general fund for the last 5 years. And we have 5-year perspective in most of these charts. We're going to key in tonight on 2020 versus 2021. If we see anything else that you want to talk about, we certainly can do that. So starting out with the fund balance is down about $12,000 for the year. So really pretty even when you take a look at 2020 versus 2021. There's some fluctuations in the categories. First of all, your unassigned was up about $522,000, just with the overall operations of the fund. Assigned up just a little bit related to some future capital outlay that you've set aside. The restricted number did decrease, which is the gray toward the bottom there, pretty substantially, and that relates to bonds that were issued last year for the fire truck, and the fire truck was actually purchased and expended in 2021. So that's where the decrease is there. And then your non-spendable, which are items that have already been paid for, prepaid items, that stayed pretty consistent with the previous year. And when we look at your fund balance policy, you've outlined a range of 35 to 40% in your unassigned, and it's 35 to 40% of next year's budgeted expenditures. So when we look at that $6.5 million that you have at year end, that's about 49% of next year's budgeted expenditures. Just to kind of give you an idea of where you're at. Well, moving on to a little more detail, taking a look at the revenues and expenditures for the year. And we already talked about the fund balance decreasing just a bit. And we did have some pretty significant changes in the revenues and expenditures. Total revenues were down about 4.9% or $611,000, and expenditures were up about $106,000 or 0.8%. And we'll look at the details of all of that in the coming slides, but overall, expenditures did exceed your revenues by almost $1.2 million for the year. But then after we factor in transfers and also the sale of some capital assets, that's where we see that decrease in fund balance of just $12,000. Oops. A little bit quickly there. So starting with the detail for the revenues, again, decreased about 4.9%, and the largest variance is going to be in that intergovernmental category. So it's the third set over from the left-hand side, and you'll see that that dropped from $5.7 million in 2020 down to $4.8 million in 2021. It's an overall decrease of about $826,000. A lot of that had to do with the CARES funding that was received in 2020. You had about $1 million that you received, and then offsetting that a little bit with some ARPA funds that you received in 2021. Another category that did see a pretty sizable change is in the charges for services, up about $165,000, which is 19% for that category. And that had to do with some of the rec fees rebounding after 2020 closures, things opening back up in 2021, and then also the city managing the airport fund for a portion of the year and creating some fuel sales that fell into that category for the year. Other categories really very consistent with the previous year. When we look at those revenues and compare them to your budgets, revenues overall were $219,000 under budget, was about 1.8%. So very close to what the city had anticipated. And there are two categories driving that under budget. The first one is the intergovernmental category. That was under budget about $193,000 related to a grant that will be received in 2020 after the required activity is completed. And then miscellaneous is the other category that was under about $87,000 related to market conditions and less than anticipated investment income. We'll look at those revenues in pie chart format. This is each source as a percentage of the whole, and compare that over the last 2 years. Typically, these charts mirror each other. This year, we had a bit of a change. The intergovernmental category was 46% last year, dropped to 41% this year, just with that CARES funding. So 46 last year was a bit of an anomaly, not something that you're used to seeing, and that created the other categories to increase for 2021. Okay, so moving then to the expenditures. These changed by just 0.8%, so very close overall to what you saw in the previous years, but there were some fluctuations between several of the categories. So if we start on the left-hand side and go into public safety, you'll see a very large orange bar, which represents 2020, and then that decrease. The decrease is about $853,000, and that's related to those CARES funds spent in that public safety category last year. One over from that, streets and highways, down about $186,000 related to fewer overlay projects and steel coating projects for 2021. And then moving a little bit further over, you'll see your cultural and recreation was actually up about $103,000, and that's due to those increased programs after the 2020 closures and some of that activity coming back for the year. And then if we go all the way over to the right-hand side, that's your largest variance. The capital outlay increased by $1,058,000. Several things going on in that category. First of all, that fire truck was purchased, emergency management system, some playground equipment, and just some other equipment. So a very large capital outlay for the year for the general fund. The next slide takes a look at your expenditures compared to the budget. Expenditures were actually about $3 million, or 18.9% under budget, and the biggest variance, as always, is going to be in that capital outlay category. So as a savings tool for future projects to avoid some of the debt service needs, unspent capital budgets are carried forward year to year. So you'll always see a large variance in that category. A couple other categories under budget as well, streets and highways, under by about $553,000, related again to those steel coating and overlay projects that were less than anticipated in the budget. And then finally, general government, under about $264,000, related to unspent contingency funds. And then finally, one more slide on the general fund. Taking a look at those expenditures as a percentage of the whole, similar to how we looked at the revenues. And here, again, we typically see very consistent spending in the general fund. A couple of things jumping out between 2020 and 2021. First of all, public safety, going from 42% down to 35% related to the CARES funds that were spent last year. And then capital outlay going from 4% up to 12% just with those significant expenditures in 2021. Questions on the general fund before we move on?
I'll point out one thing, Nancy. When we talk about lower street funding on overlays and seal coats, some of that, it's carried forward to this year, like we did no seal coats last year, but that contract is going this year. So you'll actually, I believe, see that on the council meeting. I know I have it in the budget adjustments where we're carrying those forward. So just an FYI, they're being done this year instead of last year, so.
Sure. Yep. Anything else for the general fund? All right, then we'll move on to the enterprise funds. And before I get going on the details of these funds, I just want to point out that each and every one of these funds had an operating income this year. So that's great to see that each one is charging fees to cover the expenses. So to start with the waste management fund on the chart that you see in front of you, revenue's up about 1.2%. And then expenses actually down 2.1%, allowing for an increase in the overall operating income. So the tipping fees were the thing that contributed to the increase in the revenues. And then if we look at the expense side of things, there were some retirements that were replaced by employees at the lower end of the pay scale, so some savings seen there. Moving to the sewage disposal fund, revenues in this fund actually down about 6.5%, and expenses pretty flat, decreasing just 0.2% or $3,100. The driver in the decrease in the revenues was the leachate fees due to the dry season that we experienced in 2021. And then the water fund did see a nice increase in the operating revenues, about 9.8%, also due to the dry year, so increased water usage related to that. Expenses up not as much as revenues, up about 6.1%, and that came across several categories, nothing that stood out as unusual. So overall, just about $1.1 million in operating income in the water fund. And then your last utility enterprise fund, the stormwater fund, you saw just a little bit of an increase in the revenues, about $7,600 or 1.2%, so fairly stable to the previous year. And then a decrease in the overall expenses, primarily related to wages and benefits. So still a very nice operating income of about $245,000 for the stormwater fund. And this is unusual. We see stormwater funds across the state struggling to make sure that those fees are covering all of the operating expenses. So it's good to see what you're experiencing here. This fund is not a utility, it's your liquor store. And after a record-breaking 2020, you did see a little bit of a decrease in your sales, about 2.4%. But the cost of sales decreased by a greater amount, 3.7%. And operating expenses were actually down related to the negative pension adjustment. So overall operating income for this fund did increase by about 6.2%. Gross profit was also up, and we'll take a look at that on the next slide. But I think the highlight for the liquor store fund is that you have that operating income and you're able to transfer funds to other areas of the city. So the general fund received $640,000 to help with the tax burden. The operations capital fund received about $407,000 for future capital needs, and then the Big Wood Event Center received about $36,000 for operations and capital needs in that fund. The next slide takes a look at that gross profit percentage. So you can see that you're on an upward trend and did experience 31.3% for 2021. I took a look back at 2020 at the average statewide, and it was 26.5%. So you are well above overall state averages for off-sale liquor stores. And then the last chart on the liquor fund takes a look at the two stores, comparing each, and the volume being significantly less at the east side, but the gross profit percentage being very consistent. So 31.5% in the west and 30.7% on the east. So very close when you're looking at that gross profit percentage. And we have a couple of slides to take a look at tax capacity, market value, and the tax capacity rate. And what we're starting with is that tax capacity rate. So for each of the last 2 years, that number has declined, and for 2021 went from 58.25% down to 55.49%. And the next slide really tells the story of why that happened. So your levy stayed consistent between 2020 and 2021, and that net taxable tax capacity increased significantly, so allowing for that rate, which is the function of those two pieces, to decline for 2021. So good news for the taxpayers. I just have one more chart, and this is very high level. So this is the net position for the city in its entirety. So it includes all of your funds, it includes all of the long-term assets and all of the long-term liabilities. So capital assets, long-term debt, pension, OPEB, all of that is included here. And overall, the net position did increase by almost $6.9 million or 5.1% for the year. And when we look at each of the categories, those also increased. So the unrestricted, which sits on the top, increased related to operations of the city. The restricted was actually pretty consistent from the previous year to the current year. Goes along with those restrictions in the funds. And then the bottom category, the green there, is your net investment in capital assets, and that number increased as well, related to the significant capital activity you have going on, along with paying off that debt faster than the assets are depreciating. So a positive trend in all three categories. And that is what I have. Does anyone have questions?
Well, thank you, Nancy, for the presentation and all the good information.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions for Bill or Nancy? Or Sandy?
One side comment, we did email out, so you have electronic versions of all the reports. They will also be on our website as well. So, again, this year, we're not printing paper copies. We only just make a very few in-house, but we do have it all on the website, and you did receive it, so.
Well, thank you for that, and I guess if there's no questions, thank you again for your time this evening, and we will adjourn this meeting, and we have a meeting.
We'll have you pass a resolution accepting the audit report?
I apologize, we need to pass a resolution
that's
accepting
good.
our report.
I'll offer that.
Offer that, thank you, Jim. We have a second?
I'll second.
Brent, we'll give it to you.
Okay.
Is that roll call or, roll call, please?
Gustafson.
Yes.
Fish.
Yes.
Hager.
Yes.
Swamy.
Yes.
Rupert.
Yes.
Thompson.
Yes.
Arneson.
Yes. That resolution